Hello there. Welcome back to D Community Conversations. I'm Mike Parker with the D Language Foundation, and I'm here today with Jonathan Davis, a longtime member of the D community and now a permanent member of the D Foundation's monthly meeting crew. Thanks for being with me today, Jonathan.
Hello.
Before we get started, I want to give a thanks to Weka. Weka is a fast-growing company that is building a cloud and AI-native data platform that helps to solve complex data challenges for the world's leading enterprises and preeminent research organizations. Weka is a great place to work for developers looking to sharpen their decoding skills and work on really interesting use cases. And I should clarify that is decoding skills, not decoding.
That was my first thought.
Yeah. Anytime I turn on the automatic subtitle generator in my editor, it always puts in decoding for that. Yeah. So Jonathan, thanks again for joining me today. I don't think, a lot of the people that I've had on this interview thing so far, I've known more about their background than I know about you.
Okay.
So this is going to be, I've been able to, target my questions at specific aspects of their background. So I'm coming in pretty much with a blank slate here with you. So I'm going to be learning as much as the audience is. So typically I start from the beginning, which is with your early forays into programming. When did that start? How did it get started? All that. Yeah.
You're assuming I remember. Pretty sure when I was quite young, my dad at some point had me mess around with BASIC. So I did a little bit with that, but that wasn't a lot. And I don't really remember because I probably wasn't even 10 when I was doing that. I don't remember when I started actually doing programming on my own. It was probably either junior high or high school, messing around with C and C++. Wasn't doing a lot at that point, but I started doing some. I think messed around with a bit with the computer science merit badge and Boy Scouts and things like that. When I started seriously doing anything was I was lucky in that my senior year of high school, my high school had gotten a class for doing computer science. So I was able to take computer science APA or whatever it's called, that I was able to then spend a year in a course learning the basics of programming, aside from just reading from a book on my own. And since it was an AP course, I actually managed to have that count for college and reduce how much I had to take there. And then, of course, in college, that ramped up considerably because then I was spending the vast majority of my schooling on programming and getting into various things that way. And mostly doing, just coursework whenever programming stuff came up that I would be useful for me to do on my own, for myself. So not sure there's much interesting to say about that whole process. I don't really remember what all I was doing with it back in junior high or what have you, but.
Did you know then that was a career path you were interested in that early on? Do you recall?
I don't know. I never really decided in the sense that, the only two career paths I ever seriously considered at all were being a novelist, because I really like reading and whatnot, and programming. Programming is much more stable. And much more likely to work out. So that seemed a much more practical choice. So, by the time I was a freshman in high school, I think I pretty much just knew I was going to be going into computer science and never really thought about it. It wasn't a question. How exactly I came to that, I don't know. It just always was where I was going, even though I wasn't spending tons of time programming at that point. It knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I'm not one of those people that had to wonder, where am I going to go with my degree, or, what field am I going to go into, let alone one of those people who actually goes into college and is either doesn't pick a degree when they first go in if the college lets them do that or has to switch it around because they changed their mind or whatever. I just went straight into computer science and off I went. So,
which languages did you pick up in college? Was that mostly C?
Well, in high school, in the freshman year of college, it was basically all C++, except for like the assembly course I took.
Uh-huh.
But then I stopped going to college for a couple of years to serve as a missionary for my church, and then came back. And so there'd been a gap of a couple of years, and things had changed a little bit. And at that point, they were doing Java.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, I don't know anything about Java. I don't even remember if I'd heard about Java before that point. When I found out they're doing Java, I think the teacher was even like, well, you can go, there's a course you can go take, to go learn this. I'm like, okay, I don't really want to do that because then I have to change all my courses and whatnot. And bought a Java book and looked at the thing, and it's like, oh, this is a lot like C++. This would be dumb to take a whole, semester on a course to learn this. So then I just went ahead with it. Was dealing with Java and made a fool of myself a time or two because, like, I didn't know anything about interfaces because those aren't really a thing in C++ like they are in Java or D. Mm-hmm. And I remember screwing up a test question on that because I had no clue how to create one of the dumb things because I'd never run into it. And if I'd taken the Java course, I probably would have known exactly what was going on, but I had no clue. Mm-hmm. And probably made a fool of myself asking questions about it after the test because, like, what the heck is this? It made no sense to me. So, then I was using Java primarily for school. There were some courses where there was no choice. Most of the courses initially were using Java. As you got later on, I was dealing with grad courses and things like that. Especially, they give you more of a choice. Just do whatever you wanted to use to solve the problem. And then I was using, depending on the course, it might have been functional programming, which point I did quite a bit with Haskell towards the end of college, mostly because the programming language courses I was taking towards the end were using Haskell. The courses that were actually on programming languages were focusing on functional languages, so I was doing a lot with Haskell for that. So I was using it with other stuff too. I think they were using it. Ended up doing some C# here and there, but mostly Java. There's the networking course, entertainingly enough, the teacher was like, no, we're not doing this in Java, we're doing it in C. And the reason we were doing it in C is because if we did it in Java, there would be no course. We were actually like using the socket API to, talk back and forth with machines and whatnot at the low level. So that was C, regardless of whatever we were doing in any other courses. So, there were a variety of languages I ended up using, but primarily C++ and Java, and then a chunk of Haskell towards the end would be the ones I used the most. Mm-hmm. But I ended up using several languages here and there, depending on what the course was doing.
Well, did you feel at home with any of them? Did any of them feel like, the language to you?
Not really. I mean, like, I came from the standpoint of like C++ was the thing, because that's what I'd been using. And using Java, it felt kind of gimped in comparison to C++. They simplified things considerably. I was kind of shocked to find out about how generics worked in there versus... And I don't think it even had generics when I started, but when you got to generics, that was not like templates. It's like, okay, this is very different. But like, just Java was incredibly annoying to use in comparison to C++ because of how limited it was, how much they'd simplified it. There's a great article, I forget who wrote it, called, I think, Kingdom of the Nouns, that makes fun of Java for making everything a noun, basically, because they're all objects. And comparing that to functional languages where like everything's a verb and all the dichotomies of that. For the most part, Java was annoying, but it also improved some things. Like having the GC was nice. They didn't have to worry about memory allocation in the way that you did with C++. There are various things with constructing objects that were just simpler and less error prone. And, for a chunk of college, I was considering writing my own language, having no clue what that would actually entail. So that would have been utterly stupid if I'd actually done it. But I was, looking around to see what other options there were, because none of the languages really did what I was looking for. C++ was the closest, but a lot of the C-isms and even some of the stuff that's just proper C++ is just error prone in comparison to what you get in some of the other languages, but you lost a lot of abilities with the other languages. So there were none of the, I preferred C++, but it was not like, oh, yes, this is the language I want to be using. It wins. It's like they all have problems. It's just a question of which set of problems you would prefer to be dealing with.
Right, right. So straight out of college, did you jump into working as a programmer, or?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, technically, I didn't finish college because I jumped in as a programmer. I was attending Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and they had what they called the 4+1 program, which allowed you to do your bachelor's and master's at the same time. Because normally you do like 4 years for your bachelor's, and that with a senior project, and then if you're going to go to grad school, that would take 2 years, and then you do a master's thesis, and then get your graduate degree and go off and do whatever you're going to do. So it was great to be able to do the 4+1, because then I was doing bachelor's and master's simultaneously, so I could take the courses for all of them. And I completed the full set of courses and worked on my master's thesis, and then got full-time employment after I finished all my courses, and failed to spend enough time on my master's thesis because I was working and focusing on that, and ultimately didn't finish the master's thesis. And because both degrees were done at the same time, I got no degree. That's the way that went. So I got the full college education, but didn't get the degree. So then I was working full time at that point, rather than working on the college stuff.
And what was that first job?
It was for a company called Pelco out in Fresno that works. I think they still exist. They've, I think, been sold a time or two, but they worked on video security. So I was having to deal with various programs that dealt with viewing security footage. So I had to deal with, MPEG-4 and H.264 video and things of that variety, and the applications that were showing them primarily, but also some of the back end stuff for how to deal with that.
Was that C++?
Yes, that was, I think, entirely C++. I think they ended up using some Java on some other projects. I think they might have done some projects using Python, but I didn't work on any of those. So that was heavily C++. Very weird C++ with some of the restrictions they put on us, but that was C++.
And how did you stumble on to D?
Well, like I said before, in college, I was very much looking at languages going, okay, this one's got this going for it, that one has that going for it. I like all this stuff about C++, but it's got these issues. Java improves on these various problems. C# improves on that. But they all kind of suck to one degree or another. And I've been thinking about creating my own language and was poking around on some basis. And I don't remember how I found D specifically. I recall reading the Wikipedia article, so maybe I ran into it there. I don't know. But somewhere in there, I was looking around to see what there was and ran into D probably back in 2006 or 2007. I'm not sure exactly when. I found out, I think, a bit before I started doing anything with it. I started using it in some courses. Like I think the first course I did anything with it was a graphics course with OpenGL stuff. And it was just nicer to be able to use D's arrays over the stuff in C or C++ to be able to make that work. And I think the first decompiler I used was, I think, 2.017, I want to say. And at the time, I was debating whether to do D1 or D2. And somewhat entertainingly, I went with D2 because it had const. And one of the things that annoyed me about Java was that it didn't have const. My views on that have changed considerably in the interim. But at the time, I was very much looking for const. So it's like, we'll go with D2 because this seems to have proper const. It had been implemented, I think, in like 2.015 or something. So it was quite new. So I ended up using D on some school stuff, not much, but some. And just over time, started using it more in my free time for things. Initially, I was using Haskell primarily for a lot of my personal projects towards the end of college, mostly because I was at that point approaching it like I'd been using Haskell for some of the functional courses, and I was approaching it like, well, okay, I want to learn more about programming languages, so I'll just use a programming language for a while as my go-to for personal projects, and then switch to a different one and use that for personal projects for a while so I can learn a different one. Mm-hmm. And at some point I ended up switching to D and never went back. So I haven't really, like at one point I was thinking about spending a bunch of time with Python or Ruby to learn those. I think bought books on those, but never did end up doing much with them. Mm-hmm. I've had to muck with Python here and there over the years because of other stuff written in Python, but I didn't end up using it as a go-to language like I'd been considering. Mm-hmm. But D just became my go-to language for all my personal projects because I liked it the best and just would prefer to have my stuff in D.
Yeah. I always tell people that I've said this a million times, but for me, I was mostly switching between C and Java, and I was never fully satisfied with either one of them. When I was in C, I started missing things about Java. When I was in Java, I started missing things about C. And then when I found D, it just kind of had all the answers for me, right? It just felt right, and it was fun. Is there anything specific that hooked you that you recall?
Not really. I mean, it was... I'd basically been looking at C++ and Java mm-hmm. primarily, and been looking for something that was kind of in between. Mm-hmm. And D was essentially in between. Like the fact that it had a garbage collector was great. The dynamic arrays in D were trivial to use in comparison to mucking around the stuff in C++. Mm-hmm. Things of that variety. So I don't recall any specific feature per se making it so like, oh yeah, this is totally the best, I got to use this. But like it sat in a niche between C++ and Java in a way that made it more pleasant to use than both. So that's what I ended up using primarily, even though things were much more of a mess at that point than they are now because of how much D2 was changing all the time. Mm-hmm. So like stability was not a thing at that point. Not for D2. There are problems. There are always problems. There are other things we need to fix and all that. But like, it's not like, oh, they just broke all your code again with the next release because they changed all this. I mean, like somewhere in there they changed, invariant to immutable. And I don't think that there was any deprecation process with that. It's been a while, so maybe there was. But like things like that, they're just like, oh, we need to fix this. We'll just change it.
Well, the thing with the D2's development is I think that version number, D1 started as 0 point something, right? And didn't become D1 until 2007, about the time they started working on D2.
Yeah, there's like a 6-month gap or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was just these years where, it was just a fast moving thing and everybody understood that it was breaking changes all the time, right? But then when D2 came along, they just started with the 2 point something. There was no
0.0. Yeah. 2.00, 2.01 or whatever it was.
Right. The versioning didn't seem like an alpha or a beta or a development thing, right? So it was still fast moving though.
It quickly became clear that that's what was going on if you dealt with it much at all and looked into it. But just looking at the version numbers, and there was no point where it's like D2 hit 1.0 because it's not how the versioning worked.
Exactly. Yeah. So
it's been much more gradual, reaching a point where it's as stable as it is.
Yeah, and there's no way we can look back and say, oh, that's the 1.0 version of D2. There, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Do you recall your first contributions or when you started making contributions?
I was dealing with dir entries in standard file, and it didn't handle symlinks. I forget exactly what it did, but it had no concept of symlinks. Probably because whenever it was written, everything's Windows. I don't know. I mean, it's cross-platform, but obviously some of the file stuff works differently in Windows and on Linux and other POSIX systems, and some stuff gets written with one in mind or the other. I think the function names kind of imply more of a POSIX background, but the lack of symlink support was definitely more of a Windows thing. Either way, it didn't handle symlinks properly. That was causing problems for me because at the time, Linux was my primary operating system. I don't even remember what I was coding up, but I would run into issues because it had no clue about symlinks. So I opened a bug report complaining about this, and it wasn't fixed for a while. I had no clue about how any of that worked at the time. I was like, why is no one fixing this? Pretty much because I just, assumed you open the bug report and someone would go and fix it, which probably would have happened eventually. But, given the volunteer project and there's only so many people working on it at a given time, and I think there were even fewer people working on it then than we've had more recently. And I think I asked on the bug report, I was like, why is no one fixing this? And I think Don Clungston, I think, is the one who responded, basically explained why, what the situation was. Just no one had time to look at it or whatnot. So I'm like, okay, screw this. I'm going to fix it. I went and figured out how to code it up and make the changes and add the ability to indicate whether you wanted to follow symlinks or not. It was probably always following symlinks before. I don't remember. Plenty of cases where you really don't want that to happen. But I fixed it, and I don't even remember how that worked in terms of committing it because it was Subversion at the time and I didn't have access. So I don't know if I posted it on the bug report or how that went, but I fixed that and got the change in somehow so that it actually dealt with symlinks properly.
So did this spark a series of contributions after that? Just when you had a problem, you submit the bug and fix it? Is that what happened? Or
not that I recall, but I don't remember exactly what I was doing. I mean, I was not using D heavily. I was using D for what stuff I was doing on the side, but it obviously wasn't my job. So I don't know how frequently I was running into stuff or how frequently I was programming stuff in D. It's been a while, so I don't remember the details. The main thing that changed everything was they were discussing, I think standard date it was called at the time. Walter, I think, had coded up for D1. It was being discussed as something that needed to be replaced because it was not as good as we wanted. And I had dealt with quite a few time-related issues at work. Because, remember, I was dealing with video security stuff. For that, you have things like, the timeline they show for to scroll through the video. And you get fun things like, oh, well, okay, we have a DST switch. All of a sudden, if depending on the direction, you get an hour that doesn't even exist. So you get this gap on your bar where there's no video for an hour because there's a DST switch, which isn't that bad to deal with. But then you got a DST switch that goes in the other direction. Now you have a piece of time where that 1 hour happened twice, and how do you deal with that? The real kicker, though, with it is they had 3 separate projects using the same code base, which in and of itself is not a problem. There are plenty of ways to do that sanely. They did not do it sanely. They didn't do something like, oh, we got these libraries that give you the functionality and we're reusing them. Instead, they had these 3 products that were if-deft from the same code. So this made it incredibly trivial to make a change on one of the products and break the other 2. The way that all 3 of them dealt with time was different. Like, one of them was a Windows application. The machine was in local time, and they were displaying everything in local time because people were watching video with the thing. And then they had one that was a Linux application, but it was running as a box that you had that's the only application it ran. It's not like they were running GNOME or KDE or something. It's just like it was an appliance that happened to use Linux. And because Linux is saner about what it does with the system time, the system clock was in UTC, but unlike Windows, but the system was set, of course, to local time to display local time. So those were slightly different in terms of what they're doing. And the third one was a server, so they just put the whole thing in UTC and didn't do anything with local time. And when they were passing time around, they didn't do it consistently, and they had multiple different functions for converting time, and they didn't work the same way. So you just this huge, disgusting mess of bugs. Like every time there was a DST switch, like bugs got reported, and it got fixed, and then the next DST switch, it were bugs again because it wasn't fixed correctly. So I was just utterly sick of dealing with this. I had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to fix it in that code base and educating myself on how all that worked. I mean, it wasn't even entirely straightforward to figure out what the heck time T was in terms of how that was stored. You know, on POSIX systems, it has to be seconds since January 1st, 1970 in UTC, But it was not obvious at the time that it was UTC even with what the code was doing. And when you have a bunch of different functions messing with the time all on their own in different ways, inconsistently, just makes a disgusting mess. So I was very sick of dealing with time-related bugs and had in the process become rather opinionated about how time stuff should be handled. And so when the discussion came up in the news group about replacing standard date, I'm like, screw this. I want to use D, and I want to be using a sane time solution in D. I don't want to have to deal with something dumb like I've been dealing with for ages now with the C++ stuff. So I went and wrote one, which, ended up becoming standard date time. And, there was a lot of back and forth with that initially. And it's not like every decision in that was what should have been. But for the most part, I think it's put together well, and it's turned out well overall. Tested to death. More tests than that than like anything I've ever written to make sure that worked correctly. I think there's only one time-related bug that got found after it was released, and that was something to do with BC and a leap year or something that like no one was going to actually end up doing anything with. But because I went and wrote standard date time, they gave me commit access to Subversion at that point. So at that point, it was handled a little bit differently in terms of what the Phobos team was, that primarily had to do with having commit access. And so at that point, I ended up getting more involved and working on that. It wasn't all that long after that we switched to Git, which made the whole thing saner. Standard date time changed the whole thing in terms of how much I was working on stuff.
That was a pretty big project for you, wasn't it?
Yeah. In fact, I was spending time on that when I should have been spending time on my thesis. Like I took a week off on vacation to work on that, and I think did some work on my thesis. I think, but like it's like, I'll just finish this date time thing quickly and get back to the other, and then it took like the whole week, and then some. The daytime stuff turned out fairly well overall. Did have to make a number of changes based on what was done originally, but for the most part, that worked out pretty well. So I don't know how much time I ultimately ended up spending on that, but I literally spent like a week of vacation on it trying to get it done and got a large chunk of it done.
And then later, didn't you break it up into...
There were complaints on and off about how big it was, which personally I never found it to be a problem. I'm sure part of that is I'm familiar with what's in there. Also, it helps that I use Vim, and apparently some people who used less lightweight editors had more issues with the size of the file. And I think one of the problems that made it so we really did have to change it was that GitHub couldn't handle the diffs in some cases. You made a lot of changes in a single file. So it was like 32,000 lines of code or something, including all the tests, which the tests, I think, were like half the code in there, but if not more. I forget what the percentages were. But a lot of the stuff in there is tests and documentation. So back in 2016 or 2017, I think. We were in Berlin, so it was one of the DConfs. We'd been talking about splitting it for a while, but I went and did it. I mean, like package.d became a feature because of discussions of splitting standard date time.
Yeah, right.
Because if we split it without a feature like package.d, then it would break everyone's code when we split it. Kenny Murphy and I ended up discussing that with Walter, and probably in 2014, 2013 or 2014, probably 2014 at DConf, and package.d for better or worse was the solution that came out of that. And then a couple years later, I ended up finally going and taking the time to split the thing up, which I think is mostly fine in terms of how it's split. The more annoying aspect of it is core.time, in the sense that that's over in D runtime, because it used to be in D runtime because D runtime uses the monotonic clock and it uses durations. And there's plenty of people, of course, who have no clue that it's over there because it's separated from all the rest of it. So that's why standard datetime.date, I believe, publicly imports core.time, I think, to try and work around that issue. Not quite sure if we're going to rework that or not with the Phobos 3 stuff, but overall, the split's been fine. I think that the split is largely intelligent in terms of how that ended up.
Well, speaking of DConf, that was where I first met you. That was 2013, DConf 2013. What prompted you? Yeah, what prompted you to go to DConf?
Well, I mean, I've been doing lots with D. that was after I'd done Saturday Daytime and all that, so I was quite involved. Of course, I was interested to show up, and so I went, and think I did manage to get. I can't remember now if I got my employer to pay for any of the trip or not. I did try to get them to pay for the Kickstarter, and they wouldn't. And they wouldn't do it, even though it would have meant spending less money. Either way, it's like I was, as far as programming stuff in my free time goes, it was D. So I was very interested in working on that stuff. And it's like, if we're going to have a conference, of course I'm going to show up. And at the time I was living in Fresno, and the conference was in Palo Alto. So it was not exactly hard to make the trip.
Well, it got harder once we got to Europe.
Yes, that changed the ball game considerably. That's the main reason I end up flying now is DConf.
Yeah, I think you've been to almost every DConf. I think you missed.
I missed the one 2022. I think.
Yeah. That's
that one.
That's the shirt I'm wearing. You've spoken. I should have looked this up before the interview, but you've spoken at least twice at DConf that I remember. Was it more than that?
Yes, twice. And going on the trend, it's probably going to be like a 6-year gap next or something, because it's been doubling.
So this year is going to be your third talk, yes, and we're going to get
spoken 2015 about ranges, and 2018 about DXML.
Yes, and that was going to be my next question, because the first big thing that you had was the date time. The second big thing that I remember was DXML. Wasn't that intended to get into Phobos?
Sort of. Standard XML, we long since decided was no good. And in fact, when going through the spec and everything when writing DXML, I was kind of horrified by what was in standard XML. I can't remember the details now, but it was doing some dumb stuff. I mean, it's one of those things that dated from, I think, maybe even D1. That just, someone wrote something because they were being helpful and wanted a solution, and ended up getting in because we were not very picky at the time. I was using XML for various things. I mean, part of it is I've never been a fan of JSON. I much prefer dealing with XML. There are, of course, plenty of use cases for XML where people do incredibly stupid and complicated things, which I think is why people tend to hate XML. Like we deal with SOAP and a bunch of other standards on how you deal with that. It just gets really stupidly complicated when at its core, you just got a bunch of tags. The tags are straightforward and simple for the most part. Spec could have been better on some of the aspects of that, but either way, I was doing enough with XML. I wanted a solution. At the time, I'd been off and on working on trying to create a wrapper for Qt to be able to use that for some projects, and had decided I wanted to use XML configuration files for some code generation. So it's like, okay, well, I need a decent XML solution then if I'm going to be doing that. So I spent the time to write what I thought was a straightforward XML solution. And, reading through the spec, I was utterly horrified at some of the things in the XML spec. You can list links to other stuff in the spec, or in a document, because for some reason they set it up with the idea that you could have a top section of the document define what the rest of the document was going to look like, which I don't think makes a lick of sense, because normally you define that in some spec somewhere and just you follow that with the spec. You don't need to put that in the document itself. You don't put the verification. I mean, you don't write a code file and have the verification for the code file on how to in the code file. Like, it's just bizarre. But and some of that they just don't normally use with XML anymore, even when you do crazy stuff, because it was too crazy. And so you've got other schema things they've done separately to define how to validate XML. But with all that junk at the top of the file that is technically in the spec, it includes things where you're supposed to go, okay, here's a link to a file that defines other stuff, either verification stuff or defining entities that you could then use in the file. So that in theory, you could say, okay, I mean, basically, declaring an external variable, essentially. It's like, okay, we've got this, or a macro, because you've got some other chunk of XML elsewhere that defines whatever chunk of XML you want, and you want to insert that in your document. So you effectively import it at the top of the XML file, and then you just use the name as an entity name within the XML file, such that the fully compliant parser would see the entity name and pull that information in from the other file and replace it like you would with a macro or an enum or something. How good or bad that is debatable. The real problem was that you can define URLs in there, not just files. So a fully compliant XML parser would have to be able to talk to the internet and go download documents that may or may not actually be XML documents, depending what happened to that URL since that was written. And it could be malicious something, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just over the top insane as to what they did with some of that, such that I don't know how many XML parsers actually support some of that because it's just bad. So, I mean, at one point I was considering calling DXML simple XML because I was just like, no, we're just going simple because tags are what I care about. So the entity stuff is not supported by DXML aside from the standard entities. I forget, there's like 4 of them, I think, for like the brackets and for the ampersand, and I forget what all. So those are supported, and the others, depending on how you configure the parser when you use it, either are going to result in exceptions being thrown to tell you that it can't handle it, or it just leaves the entity alone. It largely skips a lot of the crazier stuff, which for some people is then not going to do what they want. But for a lot of cases, it does exactly what you need and doesn't have a whole bunch of extra junk in it. So I wrote it for myself, for my own stuff, but because, I've done lots of stuff for Phobos, I figured there's a decent chance that we'd end up putting it in Phobos. The whole review process we had at the time had become unpleasant enough that I was not super excited at the idea of going through that to get it into Phobos. Well, I hadn't really decided one way or the other, as I recall, whether it was going to go into Phobos. It's just, I wrote it for myself, made it available with the possibility that it would go in Phobos, and I wrote it in a way that it theoretically could go into Phobos. So it was written with that in mind, but not with the idea that I was definitely going to get it in there. Of course, there's debate now as to whether an XML parser belongs in there, with some people going, no, this should just be on code.dingling.org for dub, and other people going, no, this is really basic stuff, it should go in Phobos. So there's a decent chance that some form of DXML is going to end up in Phobos at some point, but it hasn't yet.
Is DXML still in good shape?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few minor issues I need to deal with that have had bug reports. Nothing serious. I mean, like, I think the most recent one is I think it was Dennis had tried it for something and was unhappy about what some of the error messages look like and wanted that to be improved. Someone wanted me to do something with namespaces I need to look into. And I think that someone reported that there was some stray character that wasn't handled correctly that I need to track down. I really need to take the time to go and deal with those. So there aren't very many issues, but there are a couple minor ones.
But it's still up to date. It still compiles. And
still up to date. I mean, I use it all the time for my own stuff because any stray project I do where I need a configuration file, I use XML. So I'm using DXML for that all the time. Like one of the projects I have is because I still use CDs and for ripping music. And the program I used to use for that isn't supported anymore. And I really wanted to be able to edit type out the information for the CDs when you're ripping it in Vim. Really is what I wanted to do, so that I could, get all the fancy editing stuff you get in Vim as opposed to dealing with a GUI where you're just copy pasting things. And so I ended up writing a wrapper around CD Paranoia that handled that. And that's an XML file then for all the track information, so that's both reading and writing XML to deal with that. So I use the XML all the time. There are a few bug reports that I need to track down and sort out, but there's no serious breakage or anything. It's also on the list of projects that Circle CI or whatever it is, I forget, that we run for the Phobos build to make sure that we're not breaking it when we make changes. So it's still basically what it was when I released it. Still works just fine. There are probably a few improvements that should be done to it, but it's not something where I got a bunch of complaints about it. I mean, maybe not enough people are using it, and that's the problem. I don't know.
Or maybe they're happy with it. Your next big project, and I would argue your biggest project so far is the range redesign, the range API. That's a huge one for Phobos v3. And this is going to be the subject of your DConf talk coming up, so which will be closer by the time I publish this. What can you tell us about the range API so far? I don't want to spoil the talk, but...
Well, I mean, to an extent, the talk's going to be a talk version of what I posted in the news group previously about what to do with it. There may be a tweak or two in there based on some of the complaints, particularly to do with empty ranges. Some folks were complaining about what I was proposing there. I may need to change what I'm doing. I don't know. But most of the issues are quite straightforward in terms of what it is. If you just look at the issues we've been running into with stuff not defined well enough. I mean, that's the big problem with a lot of it is things just haven't. I mean, I suppose globally there are three problems. One, auto decoding, which is the big motivation really behind Phobos v3 in general. Is we have to. I don't know that we can't get rid of auto decoding in Phobos 2, but like the attempts at that have not gone so well because it's just too risky to break code. So we want to get rid of auto decoding. Ideally, we would make it so that you don't have to import anything to be able to use arrays as ranges. The other big issue, which has a lot of different pieces, is just the range API is not well defined in reality, in that there's a lot of like. In terms of pop front and front and all that, in terms of what the functions look like are well defined, but behaviorally it's not well defined. So like the state of a range when you construct one, there's not actually a guarantee in the current range API that the init value of a range is even valid. And if it's a class, it definitely won't be valid because it'll be null. So there's just all kinds of aspects of the range API that were not actually nailed down in terms of behavior that over the years have proven to be an issue. And some of the design choices there, like save was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. That was done to transport classes as ranges. There are other ways to do that, but we did it with save, and that's caused problems because most ranges don't need save, and then a few do, and so you forget to call save, and you end up with bugs in your code and whatnot. So basically, I looked over what we had and how well things were defined and the problems we've run into over the years, primarily stuff not being defined, and wrote up, what we needed to do in order to make it consistent and reliable, which in some cases means disallowing a few things. It might be annoying, but for the most part, it's how ranges already work. It's just codifying it in a way that makes it so they all have to work that way. The bigger change, which will have to happen, and I need to create a dip and get it past Walter, is that some of the function names are going to have to change just to avoid conflicts, because if we want to be able to not have to import standard range or the equivalent in Phobos 3 to use arrays as ranges, then we're going to have to put those functions in object.d. And we can't do that with the current function names because they conflict with the existing functions, which use autodecoding. There'll have to be some changes to the names of functions, which will be somewhat annoying, but it'll also make it clear that you're using the new range API with the set of requirements that go with that. I think ultimately it's not going to be all that big a deal because they'll mostly work how you're used to anyway. Anyone who is looking for like a huge rework of the whole thing and make it work completely differently will be unhappy because that's not what we've really been discussing doing at all. It's a question of, okay, what has proven to be problematic with the current range API and how do we fix it? And it's mostly worked really well. Autodecoding is the primary thing that we all looked at and go, okay, no, we don't. This was a mistake. I don't think it was as stupid an idea as some people think it was, but ultimately it was a bad idea. So we need to get rid of it, and things will be better once we do. So, in many ways, the bigger effort with all that isn't the range API itself. It's updating the rest of Phobos to then go with the new range API and whatever other changes we want to be making with the new version of Phobos.
Right. Well, the reason I say this is a big project because it's going to have, far-reaching consequences because this is defining the ranges for the future. And I wonder, you volunteered for this.
Yes.
Yeah. So why?
Well, I mean, to an extent, it's the same thing with standard date time in that it's something I cared about and I wanted it done right. Doesn't necessarily mean that someone else couldn't do it better, but I wanted to make sure that it was done appropriately. And of course, there's been discussions about what I've proposed as to whether it makes sense or not. The main D folks have thought that what I proposed made sense as it was. But really what it came down to is having used ranges for 10 plus years, whatever it is now, I've got ideas about how that really should be done in terms of fixing it. Fortunately, there hasn't been a lot of disagreement on that, aside from folks who want it to be completely changed, which is not what we were looking to do. I wanted to make sure that it was done in a sane fashion. So I stepped up to make sure it would get done. Whereas other stuff that I might not care about as much, I'm perfectly fine, letting someone else bang their head against it and figure out how to deal with it.
Well, I guess you're going to be having a lot of conversations about ranges in between the talks at DConf this year.
Quite possibly. Who knows? Those go all over the place, depending.
Okay. Well, we should point out that you are a deprogrammer now, professionally, yes?
Yes.
Yes. How did that come about?
I think it was 2017.
Uh-huh.
I was approached by the guy looking to hire people at Symmetry. I guess because I was one of the big guys, so to speak, in the D community, very involved, working standard daytime and whatnot. He decided that I'd be a good candidate considering he's looking to use D. And so he came to talk to me at DConf, and I had no clue who he was at the time. So I was halfway wondering whether someone was trying to scam me, particularly since the previous job I had that lasted for less than a week that used D did not go so well. It was a great opportunity in theory, but they wanted me to work like 12-hour days, and I'd already told them up front that wasn't going to work, and then they wanted me to do it anyway. So that didn't work out. So I was a bit more leery of things as a result of that. Fortunately, he already had some folks working for him, like Attila and John Colvin, who I knew and could talk to about. It's like, okay, this is not a scam. Right. And so I ended up working for Symmetry as a result of that for a while. Then ended up not working for a while just because of migraine issues. Had to get those sorted out before I could work full time again. Then we've gotten fortunate to be able to go back to working at Symmetry again. But just basically because I'd been doing D fairly publicly and talking to the news group alike, I was on a list of people that someone looking to hire D programmers was interested in looking at. So it paid off in that sense, I guess, even though I never went to work on D because I was looking for a job or something. I just wanted to use the language. Yeah.
So I guess that was Lath, I guess, that hired you.
Yes.
Yeah. So, he recruited several people from DConf, and other companies have recruited people from DConf. And I've said this many times now in these conversations for people who have seen these. I can't overemphasize this. If you're looking for a D job, DConf is a great place to get them. We had, I think it was in 2022, somebody got hired right there on the spot. They did the interview right there at DConf, and he got the job. So not with Symmetry, but it was somebody else. But that happens. That's one of the reasons that companies come to DConf is because they're always looking for more D programmers. So, Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to say before we go? Any parting thoughts to D users or potential contributors or people looking to attend DConf, whoever you want to talk to? Anything you want to say?
I don't know that I can really think of. I mean, it's kind of like I have a terrible time coming up with DConf talks. It's like, here, we want you to come up with something to talk about. It's like, I'm terrible at that. On the other hand, I answer questions all the time when people are asking questions on the newsgroup. At that point, it's not hard to come up with a topic. And for the most part, in terms of discussing D stuff, in the newsgroup and all that, it's because other people have questions and bring things up. Then discussing with them, not so much because I'm looking to bring things up. I do sometimes, but in terms of things to say to people, I don't know. Maybe I'll think of something tomorrow and go, oh boy, I should have said that. I don't know. But
well, what I will say is that if anybody has a question about D and would come to the forums, Jonathan refers to it as the news groups because I'm sure he uses the news group interface.
Well, technically, I use the mailing list, but
the mailing list. That's right. Yeah. But if you come to our web forums, forum.dlang.org, and have a question, it's not unlikely that Jonathan will answer you with a book. So
I wouldn't say with a book, but I think that on my website, when I put it together, I put something like the long-winded D guy or something.
Yeah, right.
It's like, I don't know.
Well, you are definitely one of the biggest helpers in the D community. I think between you and Ali and I guess Adam there for a while, you've helped a lot of people. Well, Jonathan, thanks again for joining me today. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to seeing you again at DConf in London. And if those of you who are watching, there's still time to register for DConf if you haven't yet. And if you are a student, you get a big discount. It's $100 instead of the $350, whatever it is, for the general registration. So if you're in the area, please drop by. And on the hackathon day, it is open to all. You don't have to register to come on day 4, and that's going to be September 20th, which is a Friday. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Jonathan, take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Have fun.